Okay, so today we're going to be looking back at Trump's trade policies, specifically those threats he made to the European Union about tariffs. You know, the ones I'm talking about. A lot of tough talk.
A lot of bluster for sure.
But did they work? And what does it all mean for us now, looking back from 2024? We've got a lot of articles to go through, so
Yeah, we've got quite a stack here.
let's just jump right in.
Sounds good.
One of the things that really struck me was how Trump used social media to basically announce these threats. It was like he was conducting international diplomacy through Twitter.
Yeah, it was pretty unconventional.
Totally. It felt like we were watching some kind of reality show play out in real time.
It was definitely a departure from how these things are usually handled.
It really was. So he basically told the EU, buy more of our oil and gas, or face my wrath, tariffs are coming. He even used all caps in the post, like he was yelling it from the rooftops.
Well, he definitely wasn't mincing words.
No, it was not.
His exact post said, and I quote, "I told the European Union that they must make up their tremendous deficit with the United States by the large-scale purchase of our oil and gas. Otherwise, it is tariffs all the way."
Wow. Okay, so to understand what's going on here, we got to look at the numbers.
That's a context.
Yeah, in 2023, the U.S. had a trade deficit of $209 billion with the EU. So,
Which is a significant amount of money.
yeah, it sounds like a lot, but what does that actually mean for, like, the average person?
Well, it means that the U.S. was buying a lot more stuff from Europe than they were selling back to them. $576 billion in imports versus $367 billion in exports.
So we were buying a lot of European wine and cheese,
Maybe.
but not selling them enough of our...
Whatever we were selling them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what really got under Trump's skin, right?
Yeah, he saw that deficit as proof that the U.S. was getting a raw deal in trade,
He felt like other countries were taking advantage of America.
which was a common theme throughout his presidency.
Right, America first.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. The EU isn't like one giant country that makes decisions as a unit. It's made up of 27 different countries.
Right, each with their own interests and priorities.
Exactly. So there's no single leader who can just say, all right, everyone, start buying American oil and gas.
It's much more complicated than that.
Way more complicated.
And plus, the EU was already trying to reduce its reliance on Russia for energy, especially after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Right. They were looking for more diverse sources of energy.
And they were already buying a fair amount of liquefied natural gas from the U.S.
LNG?
Yeah,
LNG.
right. In fact, over half of the EU and UK's LNG imports in 2023 came from the U.S., and that number had tripled since 2021.
Wow.
So Trump's demands,
They seem a little confusing,
but
given the existing context.
Yeah.
Well, one expert, Scott Lincecum from the Cato Institute, he had an interesting take on this. He suggested that maybe this wasn't really about forcing the EU to buy more energy. Maybe it was more about Trump setting the stage for future negotiations, kind of like a power move. Like he was trying to gain leverage.
exactly.
Interesting. And that kind of fits with his style. He was known for using these aggressive tactics, even if he didn't always follow through.
Right, he liked to keep people guessing.
Yeah. But there's another thing to consider here. The trade imbalance isn't always as straightforward as it might seem,
That's true.
because a lot of that trade involves parts and components that companies are shipping back and forth across borders. So it's not just finished products moving from one country to another.
Right, it's about global supply chains and how interconnected economies really are.
Yeah, so think about a BMW.
Yeah.
They import parts to assemble cars here in the U.S.
Right,
So some of that so-called deficit actually reflects transactions within the same company.
exactly.
It's not just about how much stuff is going where.
It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's about the whole system. And we also have to remember that there were concerns here in the U.S. about what increased LNG exports would do to domestic energy prices. Because if we're selling more of our natural gas to Europe, could that mean higher prices for us here at home?
Right, that was a real concern.
And what about the environmental impact?
Yeah, the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, she even issued a statement highlighting those potential downsides. More carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Potentially higher prices for Americans.
Which is kind of ironic, because Trump campaigned on bringing down energy costs.
Right, he was tapping into that frustration people were feeling after the inflation spike in 2022.
Yeah, he promised cheaper gas and lower bills.
But increasing LNG exports could actually push prices up.
It's complicated.
It is.
And, this wasn't even the first time Trump had pulled this kind of move with the EU.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had a similar back and forth with them during his first term. He even struck a deal in 2018 with the European Commission president at the time, Jean-Claude Juncker, to sell more LNG. But here's the thing. The U.S. government can't force private companies to sell their products in specific places. And the EU can't force its member states to buy American fossil fuels.
Right, it's a free market.
Sort of. But it's definitely a tangled web of economic and political forces. And you can't just dictate how things will go.
It's not that simple.
Not at all. And of course, we can't forget about what the public was saying about all this, especially on platforms like Reddit.
Oh yeah, Reddit was buzzing.
People had a lot of strong opinions.
They did.
Some were worried about what these tariffs might mean for their wallets. Would everyday things like orange juice get more expensive if we couldn't import as much from places like Brazil?
Right, people were already feeling the pinch from inflation.
Yeah, they didn't want to get hit even harder.
And there was also a lot of skepticism about whether Trump really understood how trade works.
People brought up his history with bankruptcies and called him the king of debt.
Ironic.
Very. They wondered why he was so obsessed with other countries owing money.
When he himself had struggled with debt.
Exactly. Some people even compared this whole thing to Brexit. You know, the UK leaving the European Union.
Right.
And how messy that whole situation turned out. They worried that Trump's approach would have similar consequences. You know, hurting the U.S. economy and damaging relationships with important allies.
Yeah, that was a big concern for a lot of people.
And then there was this whole sentiment about wanting Europe to be more independent, maybe even forming a United States of Europe,
Wow.
so they wouldn't be so reliant on the U.S.
Interesting.
They saw Trump's tactics as a kind of wake-up call.
Like it was time for Europe to chart its own course.
Exactly. Others were worried about the U.S. losing its standing as a reliable ally and what that might mean for global stability.
Right, would it create an opportunity for China to step in and exert more influence?
Yeah, that was a concern for a lot of people. And of course, you can always count on the internet for some humor.
Always.
People were poking fun at Trump's style, calling him the Oprah of tariffs.
Like he was just handing them out to anyone who crossed him.
Exactly. It's amazing how these complex economic and political issues can spark such a range of emotions and responses.
It really is.
It just goes to show that trade policy isn't just some abstract concept. It affects people's lives.
It shapes how they see the world.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting when you compare Trump's approach to trade with how other presidents have handled these kinds of issues.
Yeah, he was definitely more,
Confrontational.
he wasn't afraid of a fight.
No, he wasn't. Most presidents try to work things out through, established channels, like the World Trade Organization, or by negotiating deals one-on-one with other countries.
Right, the traditional approach.
Yeah, they see trade as a way to build relationships and cooperate,
But Trump, he seemed to view it more as a zero-sum game.
like one winner and one loser.
Exactly. He talked about trade in terms of winning or losing,
And he was determined to make sure America came out on top.
even if it meant ruffling some feathers along the way.
Yeah, he didn't mind making enemies.
Not really. So the big question is, did his tactics actually work? Did all those tariff threats really bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.?
That's the million-dollar question.
Or did they just end up costing consumers more?
Well, economics and politics are rarely simple.
Right. So no easy answers.
I'm afraid not.
Okay, so what did the experts have to say about all this?
Well, most economists agree that tariffs have a mixed bag of effects.
Okay.
In the short term, they can protect certain industries here at home by making imported goods more expensive.
Okay, so that makes those domestic products more competitive.
Exactly.
But doesn't that also mean higher prices for consumers?
It can. And in the long run, tariffs can actually slow down economic growth and even trigger retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
So like a trade war.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a trade-off.
It is.
Or literally.
And when it comes to those specific tariffs that Trump imposed on the EU, the evidence is a bit murky.
Murky how?
Well, some studies suggest that they did lead to job losses in certain sectors, particularly in manufacturing.
Oh, so they might have actually backfired.
It's possible, but it's hard to say for sure, because there were so many other things happening in the economy at the same time.
Right, like the recovery from the pandemic and those global supply chain issues.
Exactly. It's hard to isolate the impact of the tariffs.
Like trying to untangle a giant knot.
Yes, exactly.
But one thing seems clear. Trump's approach created a lot of uncertainty and volatility in the global trading system.
That's true.
And that kind of unpredictability can be really bad for businesses.
Absolutely. They need to be able to plan for the future.
And when the rules of the game keep changing,
It makes it hard to invest and create jobs.
it's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Right. And that uncertainty, it can spill over into other areas too, like foreign policy and international relations.
Oh, I see.
When you start using tariffs as a weapon, it could erode trust.
And make it harder to cooperate with other countries.
Exactly.
Because trade isn't just about economics.
Right.
It's about building relationships.
Working together to solve common problems.
And that's what was particularly concerning about Trump's approach. He seemed willing to use trade as a bludgeon, even against long-standing allies like the EU.
He wasn't afraid to play hardball.
So that brings us to another big question. What was the long-term impact of all this on America's relationships with its allies?
Did it cause lasting damage?
That's what we need to figure out.
Well, it definitely caused some friction and tension.
Especially with the EU.
Right.
They were already wary of his America First rhetoric.
And his skepticism about international organizations like NATO.
And those tariff threats just added fuel to the fire.
They did.
Some European leaders felt like the U.S. was no longer a reliable partner, like they couldn't count on America to have their back.
They felt like they had to start looking out for themselves more.
Which is understandable.
It is.
And that could have some pretty big implications for the future of the global order. If the U.S. steps back from its traditional leadership role,
it creates a void
that other countries like China might be eager to fill.
Exactly.
So it seems like Trump's trade policies were a bit of a gamble.
You could say that.
He was betting that he could use strong-arm tactics to get concessions from other countries and bring those manufacturing jobs back home.
But he also risked damaging America's reputation and undermining its standing in the world.
And that kind of damage can be hard to repair.
Even with a new administration in place.
So where does this leave us? What are the key takeaways from all of this for our listeners?
Well, I think it's important to remember that trade is complicated. It's not just about who's buying what from whom.
Right.
It's about global supply chains, economic interdependence, and the complex web of relationships between countries.
And trying to oversimplify it.
Can lead to policies that backfire.
Like those easy answers that politicians love to promise.
Exactly.
But rarely deliver.
We also need to be aware of the potential downsides of protectionist policies, like tariffs.
Because while they might seem appealing in the short term,
they often come with hidden costs.
Like higher prices for consumers?
Slower economic growth.
Yeah.
Strained relationships with our trading partners.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, protecting domestic industries, without choking off global trade and hurting consumers in the process.
Exactly.
It's a delicate balance.
And finally, I think it's important to remember that trade policy isn't just about economics.
Right.
It's about politics.
Yeah.
Foreign policy. Even national identity.
It's about how a country chooses to interact with the rest of the world, what values it prioritizes, and what kind of future it wants to build.
And those choices have consequences that ripple out far beyond our borders.
It's amazing how something that might seem dry and technical, like trade deficits and tariffs,
can actually be so deeply connected to these bigger questions.
About global power dynamics and international relations.
It highlights the importance of staying informed and engaged with these issues.
Because they affect all of us.
Whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, it really does make you think about how all these pieces fit together.
It does. And, I think this is where you, the listener, come in. As someone interested in this topic, it's important to keep digging into these issues, especially as the world becomes more multipolar. With the rise of China and other players on the global stage.
Oh, yeah. That sounds like a whole other deep dive. Maybe we'll tackle that one next time. But before we get sidetracked, let's circle back to that question we posed earlier about whether tariffs can actually bring back manufacturing jobs, or if they just lead to higher prices for consumers.
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
And as much as we'd all love a simple answer,
I think the reality is much more nuanced.
No easy answers, huh?
I'm afraid not.
Okay, so looking back at the Trump era and his, love affair with tariffs, what can we learn from that experience?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways, I think, is that tariffs are a very blunt instrument. They can have all sorts of unintended consequences.
And often create more problems than they solve.
Exactly.
Like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Right. And when it comes to those manufacturing jobs, there are so many other forces at work, not just trade policy.
Like what?
Well, automation, for example, has been a major driver of job losses in that sector.
Oh, yeah, those robots.
They're here to stay.
Tariffs or no tariffs.
Exactly. So while tariffs might offer a temporary Band-Aid for certain industries,
they're not a long-term solution.
Not really.
So if tariffs aren't the answer, what is? How do we support American workers and create good-paying jobs in this, globalized economy.
That's the big question policymakers are grappling with right now.
Yeah.
Well, there are no silver bullets,
Of course not.
but some potential solutions involve investing in education and training programs.
So helping workers adapt to the changing demands of the job market,
Exactly.
making sure people have the skills they need.
For those jobs of the
The
future.
ones that maybe don't even exist yet.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's also about fostering a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, creating an environment where new businesses can take root and grow.
Leading to more opportunities for everyone.
Hopefully.
So instead of clinging to the industries of the past, we need to look ahead, invest in the industries of the future.
Exactly.
But that sounds like a tall order.
It is, but it's essential. If we want to build a future where American workers can not only compete, but thrive.
So they have a chance to pursue their dreams and build a good life.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring those controversial tariffs and their impact on the relationship between the U.S. and the EU.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Just that these issues are complex and ongoing. They will continue to be debated and shaped by future events.
So it's important to stay informed.
Absolutely. Engage in thoughtful discussions and consider the different perspectives out there.
Don't just accept things at face value.
Right.
Question, explore, and form your own conclusions.
Exactly.
We can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend these issues don't exist.
They affect us all.
And we need to be part of the conversation.
Shaping the world we want to live in.
Well said. All right, well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into Trump's trade tariffs. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And remember, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.